Thanks for joining us from your home in Huntersville now, right?
Yeah, we'll be going to Reverend Graham's funeral here shortly. I'd like to be there in person. Sorry I can't be.
We appreciate you spending time with us this morning. Before I start, I'd like to thank Greg Ganji and Kathleen Clabby and all the university staff that puts this together every year. And I'd also like to thank my good friend Marcus Wilhelm of Strata Solar that works really hard to attract all of us to his town here in Chapel Hill. I'm honored to be able to introduce our senator, Thom Tillis, who's from my hometown of Cornelius. I'd like to tell you a little bit what I know about Thom, and of course he'll tell you more himself. But you know, Thom is one of only 100 Americans that serve in the United States Senate. Growing up, Thom moved 20 times, never went to the same school twice. Despite that, his senior year, he was voted class president. And while a lot of his fellow students went on to college, Thom went to work. And he worked hard for about 10 years. But his management saw leadership, intelligence, and most importantly, initiative in Thom. So Thom went back to school and he started working as a management consultant for PricewaterhouseCoopers. In 1998, he came to North Carolina from the DC area to better serve his largest client, which at the time was Nations Bank, now Bank of America. IBM bought out his department, and they made Thom a partner, which is a rare thing at IBM. And from what I can tell, you know, Thom has been able throughout his career to take complex problems and break them down into comprehensible, simple solutions that he can work with others to implement. This has really served him well throughout his business career. And it reminds me, you know, Thom reminds me of a quote that Steve Jobs once said. And he said, "Simple can be more difficult than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean, to make it simple. But it's worth it in the end, for once you can do that, you can move mountains." And taking what seems to be intractable problems and finding workable solutions is Thom's best quality, a quality that served his constituents well when he decided to become a public servant. His career in politics started in 2002, when the last piece of our neighborhood was going to be turned into houses. He jumped in and joined a local government committee and turned this natural area, part of it, into a mountain biking course and preserved the rest. This success led him to become a town representative and later voted into the state house in 2007. Now, as a struggling first-time entrepreneur trying to keep the lights on, I met Thom and his wife Susan in 2010 at a Chamber of Commerce event in Lake Norman. And while most politicians lack a certain air of authenticity, Thom really listened to everything I said. It was apparent to me that he was interested in my company. He was interested in solar as a technology, and I think he was sincerely interested in the jobs and the investment that were being made in our state at the time. A year later, I invited him to come to Mount Airy to help us open the first solar farm that we had called Mayberry Solar. And he was Speaker of the House at the time. Instead of coming in and speaking 30 minutes and leaving, he came early. He stayed for the entire session, and he met a lot of us that work in the solar industry in North Carolina. And throughout his tenure as a state legislator, you know, he listened to all sides. He did what he thought was right to continue the job creation and the investment in this industry. And he's gone on to do great things federally, which we're going to talk a little bit more today. So before I finish, I do want to just say a few things that happened while Senator Tillis served our state as the Speaker of the House. We went in 2007 from having about 3.7% of our electricity generated from clean energy sources to 10%. That was generated from clean energy sources by the time he left. From 2007, when he started in the state legislature, until 2016, $10 billion of private sector investment were made in this industry in this state. There are now over 30,000 people working full-time in North Carolina in the clean tech industry. And while there are many people in this audience that were part of that, I sincerely believe without Thom Tillis in the state legislature, a lot of this could not have been accomplished. So with that, we're lucky to have a leader like Senator Tillis here today, and I'd like to give him the opportunity to make some remarks before we start a discussion on what he did and what he's doing now.
Well, thank you, Joel. That was very gracious. It was too long, but very gracious. No, I'm kidding. I want to get to the discussion that you all are most interested in, but I do want to go back and talk about the journey of solar in North Carolina. When I came into the state legislature, it was after I defeated a two-term Republican incumbent who was, I'm sure, a good person, but just so caught up in ideology, you couldn't set things aside and determine what are sound conservative strategies that actually attract people on both sides of the aisle. And I think that what we did with the renewable portfolio standard is an example of what we need to do nationally, and I would argue even globally, if you really want to get sustaining solutions to environmental problems. So when the renewable portfolio standard began, the legislation began, and in my time as in the minority, there was a proposal out there that almost certainly could have been passed without a single Republican vote. There was a Democrat governor. They had majorities in both chambers. And it was clear to me that that could happen. I was a part of a group of people who tried to work with the Democrat leadership, the Democrat majorities at the time, to say, why don't we do something that's reasonable, that the people on the other side of this issue will not be constantly coming after you trying to get it repealed, and that's enduring and sustainable. And that's really what we got. When the bill was passed, the Senate bill that was ultimately passed by the House, it was negotiated where all of the stakeholders came to an agreement and came to a renewable portfolio standard in North Carolina that is primarily the reason why we have seen that dramatic increase in the amount of energy from alternative energy. But it was done by actually accepting something less than perfect, but something that's produced a lot of good. Now, if you fast forward a couple of years and we take a majority and I become Speaker of the House, one of the first things that some of my members thought we were going to do was repeal the renewable portfolio standard. And I, as the Speaker, did not allow that to get on the agenda. I allowed hearings to be held, and I allowed people to take input. But I was convinced, I know it was counterintuitive to those who thought it should be repealed, that what would happen is that not only would we see a downward trend on renewable inputs, we'd see an upward trend in rates. And I was explaining to them, you can't convince me that the trend lines are either good in terms of environmental impact or good in terms of fiscal impact. So that's why I stood firm. And I think today we're seeing the results. Over 30,000 jobs created in North Carolina, billions of dollars of investments. We're in the top quartile. Arizona and North Carolina are frequently held out as some of the standard bearers for success in the solar industry. And it's an enduring policy now. We've gotten past this idea of if I get elected, I'm going to repeal it, because it's working. You always have to evolve it, but it's working. There's one other project, and I think, Joe, you're aware of it, but there's another project that I'm proud of because it was exactly the same methodology to get it done. It was a project here in Mecklenburg County, a former EPA Superfund site, a site that had serious environmental problems, where a gentleman came to me and he had a project where it was going to be an energy research center. It was going to have a mass to energy incineration component to it. It was going to have a number of other leading edge future technologies, but possibly technologies that could compete with solar at some point. But what we did with that project is very similar to how we ultimately dealt with the renewable portfolio standard. We got all the stakeholders in the room, including the Sierra Club. And we tried to address all their concerns. And at the end of the day, it did have an effect on the renewable portfolio standard because it had to do with renewable energy credits. But we had a lot of people who were stewards of that RPS who came together and either vocally supported the bill or didn't oppose it. And the reason I consider that to be a significant success, when you have a project that affects renewable portfolio standards, or RECs as they call them, the renewable energy credits, and you have something that actually burns matter and creates energy, and you can have the Sierra Club be silent on it, then you've done something. And I think the Sierra Club showed their willingness to work on good, sound, sustainable policy. That's what we have to do to continue to build on what North Carolina's done, what we need to do more at the national level to incent the kinds of strategies that North Carolina's implemented or facilitate them. And then we have to have that discussion on a global level. That's the kind of thing that can actually realize the aspirations of some of the global agreements that are more like, hey, let's work on this and see what happens. We have to find a way to make it enduring, sustainable, and have people accountable for producing the results. I could talk about any number of things, but I know you have questions we want to get to. I thought that that's probably a good way to at least talk about things that should be relevant to the audience. And thank you for having me again. I'm sorry I can't be there in person.
I want to follow up a little bit with what you said, Thom. You know, Ohio, pretty much the same year, implemented an REPS and went the opposite way. They froze their REPS, and while industry was just starting to build in Ohio, it pretty much stood still. And you don't hear anything about the number of jobs, the investment, or the companies that are in Ohio doing clean energy anymore. But you do about North Carolina. So you're now in the Senate, and I'd love to ask you, do your colleagues ask you about North Carolina? Are they jealous? Do they think, do they ask you what you did right? Or how is what's happening in North Carolina perceived among your colleagues in the Senate?
Well, if they've studied North Carolina, they should be jealous on several levels, not the least of which is our university system. But if they don't know about it, I always make it a point to bring it up to them, particularly things like, the issue, we had the issue with the tariffs on solar panel input. So I have recently been able to spend a lot of time talking with members to explain to them why it's a bad idea to put down or put pressure on the solar industry at a time when the industry has proven they're financially viable and they're going to be able to do it on their own. When we extended the tax credits through the end of 2021, they were okay with it because they can see that the business environment in place is sustainable. So we help them to a point, they become a going concern, we move on. Those are the best kinds of tax credits versus the perpetual ones. So while we were having, when we were talking about that and trying to get the administration to a place that would not be damaging to the industry, I had an opportunity to speak with a lot of them. They said I had no earthly idea. When I think about North Carolina, I don't think about solar industry. I think about the western states of Nevada or in Arizona. I said, you really ought to take a look at it because it was something that started about 10 years ago that's had extraordinary results, and you could replicate those results in many of the United States. So there have been people that have come to me. I've actually heard more from Republican legislators in red states asking me how we did it and how we kept it on the books because they're seeing the results. So I'm spending probably or having more discussions with other states who are trying to think about doing that, very similar to work that we did on criminal justice reform and trying to help facilitate that through the various legislative conferences that they have, NCLS and other legislative conferences.
Very good. I want to go back a little bit to your time in the State House. And, you were elected in January of 2007, and Senate Bill 3, or the REPS, passed in December. And for anyone who wonders, Senator Tillis voted for that legislation. And at the time, it was a pretty bipartisan piece of legislation that almost all of whether you're Republican or Democrat voted for in 2007. And it was one of the pieces that's made North Carolina really a clean energy leader in our country. Now, there's several other pieces that happen. In 2010, we had a state investment tax credit that was getting ready to expire. And what an investment tax credit does, as Senator Tillis mentioned, it really shouldn't be permanent, but it should incent private sector investment into an industry that will be able to grow on its own eventually. So I guess it was House Bill 1829 at the time in 2010 would extend the state tax credit until 2015. You just become Speaker of the House. And how did you vote on that bill? I think
oh, heck, I don't remember. I voted on so many bills. I would guess that I supported it because it was strategic to the continuance of the industry. I think if you look back at any of the measures, whether it's up in the Senate or in the House, these were the things that you had to continue to do to give the industry time to become viable, to become going concern. So, to be honest with you, I didn't do a lot of vote prep here. So how did I vote on it, Joel?
Well, you voted for it. You voted for it. And the way our state implemented it, I think is very important to look at. We didn't vote on a rebate just to give money out. We voted on an investment tax credit that said no taxpayer could exceed 50% of the amount of taxes they paid to the state, so that the state would always ensure it would get income from the taxpayer. Furthermore,
see, I'm not good with bill numbers. I do know policy, and that was a part of what you're trying to do. The reason you structure things this way, this is why people at either end of the ideological spectrum drive me crazy. Because there would be some that says, well, we should be able to give 100%. There are others that say we should give 0. What we were trying to do were balance or provide good balanced policy that I knew would not be subject to the next election. And the way you do that is to kind of have equal measures of people who are stakeholders who are invested in it. If government gives you 100% of everything, then you have no incentive from the private sector's perspective to give anything, right? So when you have the balance, that's when you actually have a mutual benefit and a mutual interest in being successful.
You know, I truly thought that the policy was smart, because not only could you not eliminate a taxpayer, but you had to continue to be in the state for 5 years to get the tax benefits. So in one way, you're also retaining companies and retaining taxpayers in the state by allowing them to use this investment tax credit. So I thought it was ingenious, and what we've seen is a wide variety of large companies that had the opportunity to leave the state, but possibly because they wanted to continue to get this benefit, stayed in the state, kept employing people in the state. And that's the type of smart policy that, when I look at what Senator Tillis has voted for and the input he's given, it's not just an up or down vote. He tries to make sure the legislation has a long-term, long-lasting effect that will survive the next election cycle. So, you mentioned briefly in your opening remarks that there was some opposition from this, and particularly from your own party. And I noticed that you took, one of my favorite people, Ruth Samuelson, on one hand, and you took another representative from Rutherfordton on the other, and you really let them kind of battle it out. I mean, your leadership and being able to say, okay, look, there's two competing opinions about should we keep our incentives for clean energy, should we keep our policies for clean energy in the state or not? You let that battle happen. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like for you as a speaker?
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Ruth Samuelson, God rest her soul, was just so strong on reasonable, sustainable energy policy. And of course, Mike Hager, formerly worked for Duke, was an engineer. It was kind of funny. I pitted a four-wheel drive truck driver against a Prius and got them in a room and say, guys, work this out. But you have to do, if you can convince me that we need to reopen the policy and make it better, great. We're not going to end it. So let's have a reasonable discussion about things that we should do to modernize it. Are there technologies in it that at the time that we passed the bill, we thought were viable, that we should allocate renewable energy credits to, that we should look for some other purposing or increase opportunities for existing technologies. And by the way, consult with all the stakeholders that came together to support Senate Bill 3, make sure that they're represented in the room. And of course, I think that Ruth, who was just an incredible leader, did a good job. And I should also mention Chuck McGrady, and many people may not know this, but Chuck, a legislator from Western North Carolina, was a former president of the National Sierra Club. He was a corporate attorney focused on environmental law, and he's a Republican. And I made sure that he was in the room also helping with this discussion. So again, we could just get to good, reasonable, fiscally sound, sustainable, clean energy policy.
And let me say also, I mean, we're in North Carolina. When I just saw a recent report this morning, and they grade different states for the number of kilowatt hours or kilowatts per person of solar that's been installed. And North Carolina is not only in the lead, we're almost more than everybody else combined. And it takes not just business, not just political, not just regulatory. It really takes a utility that is as well to allow this to happen. And for whatever you say about Duke, had it been any other utility, I doubt North Carolina would be in the position we are today. And many of us have had a very good working relationship with Duke. Senator Tillis has always tried to include all the stakeholders in the discussions. It's really allowed you guys who are students to come into a state and an industry and have a career based on a foundation that is the best in the Southeast.
Yeah, and Joe, I would say that again, for someone who may say that we should have taken a more liberal policy and not, and because there are some people that consider the investor-owned utilities and other players in the energy industry as evil, I would just tell me what states it's done it that's produced results that North Carolina have. I think that the way we did it was getting people in the room versus the political gotcha, we won this vote, knowing that when elections happen, maybe that gets rescinded. The reason why we have a successful, sustainable policy is we didn't demonize anybody in the mix, and we leveraged and created synergy by everybody being in the mix.
Well, in 2015, I believe you became one of the honored 100 members in the Senate. And there was a rare bipartisan bill that was brought up called the Energy Modernization Act of 2015. It was the first relevant federal legislation that would modernize kind of our energy policy since 2007. It was uniquely bipartisan because I guess the senator from Alaska and the senator from Washington had come together to design it. And you supported it as well as 84 of your colleagues. Mm-hmm. But somehow when it got to the House, I think it was Representative Ryan decided that it wasn't important to vote on that. Can you give us a little background? I know that was just when you started, but a little background on that bill and what you saw happen behind the scenes that kind of stopped that bill from getting approved?
Well, first off, Lisa Murkowski and Senator Cantwell, I think, did a great job working together. Lisa Murkowski is a very, very solid player in the energy space, and I know a lot of people associate her with fossil fuels because she's from Alaska. But she's done a really good job of producing a good portfolio of balanced policies. I think that was an example where what you needed to do, I can't recall the members who voted against it. I'm almost certain that it would have been largely Republicans, and Joel, you may know that voted against it in the Senate. What we should have done, or what should have been done, I wasn't a lead on the bill, I supported it, is maybe have that vote be instructive to what we needed to do in the House to get support for it. In other words, if a good number of the people who in the House chose not to take it up happen to overlap with Senate members who voted against it, or maybe with people who are targeted by various outside activist organizations, there may have been a way to get the votes. It was really something that when we pass a bill out of the House or Senate, what happens at a transactional level is generally something that's managed more by the bill sponsors or the bill managers. In that particular case, I wasn't engaged, and I was also relatively new. But I think that those are, a part of what I have my staff doing is always going through, instead of everybody trying to come up with a new and different idea, I said, why don't you go back to policy that seems to be good baselines that either made it out of the House and languished in the Senate or vice versa. And that's really the area that we're looking at as a part of building our portfolio, because you have a natural baseline. You have all the work that was done to formulate policy to gain coalitions, and that's the way that and I'm not on the committee of jurisdiction for energy policy, but in the areas where I am on committees of jurisdiction, that's how I go about doing it. And hopefully people are for that bill in the House and back in the Senate.
I want to talk a few more things that that we really appreciate your support on now. So I'd like to talk about some things that I'd like to talk about. The federal tax credit was up for expiration in 2016. I would tell you that our senators, both Senator Tillis and Senator Burr, worked very hard with their colleagues to talk about the merits of extending the federal investment tax credit for clean energy. This is, all of us who work in the clean energy industry and in the utility industry know that energy is very unique. Banking requires all sorts of regulations, but energy requires even more. So if you want to work in this industry, you're going to have to understand the politics of it, the regulatory policy of it, the community aspect of development, the business side. There's so many aspects that makes it a fascinating business, but one of the things is again, this tax policy that we've used in the state to incent certain investments that the government doesn't necessarily want to make itself, but they want private industry to step up and make that investment. So these federal tax credits were set to expire. And our senators got together, talked to the other senators, and I know, Senator Tillis, that these tax credits got extended, and I've been told by SEIA in large parts because of the efforts that you and Senator Burr made.
Our pitch was pretty simple. Why don't we fulfill our promise? The industry is not asking for an extension beyond the planned sunset. Just fulfill our promise. So to me, when we were able to show the success of the program, and all we were asking for was allow the industry to continue the glide path down and then become independent at the end of the sunset. I'd like to say it was real hard, but honestly, it was a good sell, and it wasn't that difficult. Of course, it helped that we'd probably not vote for the bill if it wasn't in there, but it never really got to that point. I mean, honestly, it was something that after a limited number of discussions, and with Senator Burr in particular on the Finance Committee, we weren't asking for something new. We weren't asking for a handout. We weren't saying, well, our original policy isn't working, so we need more time. All we said was, let's fulfill our promise. It wasn't a significant amount of money in the scheme of things when you think about the federal budget, but it had enormous impact on the economic contribution the industry is making in the states that have taken the bull by the horns and been very successful.
And I don't want to give the impression that everything you've done has been for the industry. I know that when you were a state representative, you enacted a very successful tax reform package that has really put North Carolina in a very fiscally responsible state. It's lessened the burden on businesses and taxpayers in the state. And you supported the tax reform package in the Senate as well, which was passed. So again, I don't want to give the impression that that you've only supported these tax credits, but I think I definitely want to give the audience the impression that these things matter to build an industry, and we would not have been invested $10 billion in our state had we not had thoughtful leaders, both in the State House and the State Senate, to implement that. And federally, though, there's been a lot less leadership that we've seen. It's a lot more difficult to get anything related to energy policy passed, as we saw in 2015. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're learning or what you think might be possible? Are there any bills that we don't know about that might make it easier for the clean tech industry to continue to grow across the country, not just North Carolina?
Well, I think we have to start looking at the emerging technologies. I was in a meeting this week regarding the great advances of storage. You may know about the pilot project and some of the work going on in Australia in terms of integrating solar generation with storage capabilities. I think we've got to start having a policy discussion about how do you do that and how do you lay the groundwork for renewables becoming a very important part in the future of what we need for base load, for reliability, for national security, for a number of other reasons. And I think there's a role to play for the federal government to help facilitate that process. The regulatory process is one example. We need to take a look at regulations that are absolutely essential for safety, environmental quality, but claw back regulations that no longer make sense so that you can increase the time to market. I'll give you, there's one example, it may be a small one, but it's very important. It doesn't relate directly to your question, but it has to do with power supplies for certain LED components. I worked on regulation that what we found was because of the that's what people really need to understand what we're talking about with regulatory reform. There are some people who want to eliminate all regulations. That's irresponsible. There are some people think you should keep all the regs on the book, just add more. That's equally irresponsible. I'll give you one example of what happens when you don't look back at regulations and right-size them. A very prominent LED manufacturer in North Carolina have really changed the industry in terms of affordable retail LEDs. The light bulbs in the office that I'm broadcasting from are all LED light bulbs, and they've created other components though that had a power supply element to it that's more like a ballast you find in a fluorescent light. However, the way the regs were interpreted, they were actually having to go through the same testing process that you would for the power supply on this PC that I'm communicating with you all with. That process can take months or years if you make an adjustment. And in the case of this manufacturer, was to make it more efficient, it had to go through this process as if it was a standalone power supply that had to be subjected to other electrical standards, things that made sense. So part of what we have to do is not a boil the ocean thing. It's go through these regulatory constructs and get them right, particularly in technologies that involve electricity, that involve electronic components, because I think we can dramatically contract and reduce the time to market of new and innovative technologies if we go back and take a good, responsible, methodical look at regulations that no longer make sense, or at least do not make sense to technologies that weren't even contemplated when the regulations were first put on the book. Those are things I think you can work on a bipartisan basis, and that's why they're more of an interest to me than these shiny objects, things that people like to propose that virtually almost never get passed. Well,
let me ask you a little bit about the EPA, since we're talking about regulation. I think what you're people on both sides of the issue. It's a complicated question, but at a Clean Tech conference, a lot of us are kind of wondering what your thoughts are related to the role of the EPA. Should there be any federal regulations to limit carbon dioxide emissions, mercury emissions, coal ash disposal, lead in water, those sorts of things? Because it seems like with the new administration, there's a definitive shift away at the MPA? And not to put you on the spot, but I'd just like to ask what your opinion
Well, look,
is.
I think there's a role to play, but I also think you know that when we had the Dan Rivers spill, I had tasked the gentleman I mentioned to earlier, the former member of our president of the National Sierra Club. I put him on point to try and come up with something that made sense. There were a lot of emotions involved. So again, there were a lot of people who had as much of a political agenda as they did a policy agenda, wanting to shut down the investor-owned utility and really drive up rates. And ultimately, it would even have, if you had the extreme, it could have even had an effect on the solar industry because of the disruption that they could have had. I'm not one who thinks that that there's not a role for the EPA. But one thing I would like to see is more of a role of facilitation, so that the various state departments of environmental quality or the equivalents in other states like North Carolina to figure out a way again to where you don't have a duplication of effort, you don't have a duplication of regulators, and you don't have that multiplier effect on complexity. Because every dime that the solar industry or any other industry spends on regulations, it's one less dime on R&D. So how do you make the fix? I'll give you an example of a policy that I think went too far, and I support it, the effort against the waters of the U.S. Anybody who looked at the waters of the U.S. without passion, just objectively, would have to argue that the vast majority of that regulatory construct was going to add cost, not add value. It could also have a significant economic impact, which is why which has a direct impact on resources you can have to research, develop, and implement new technologies. And it's also why bipartisan coalitions of county commissioners, urban cities, rural cities also agreed that it was maybe well-intentioned but poorly executed. So there is a valid question around, are the regulations on the books right-sized, appropriate, and if they're appropriate, are they appropriate to be implemented and ensure compliance at the federal level or the state level? This is another example where I haven't agreed in lockstep with the administration. There was particularly one person who would have been tasked, a presidential nominee who would have been tasked with environmental quality. I met with and determined, Senator Burr and I determined that we did not think he was the best fit for the job. And we communicated that to the Committee of Jurisdiction, ultimately the administration, and they withdrew the nominee. Again, let's not do it's good or bad. Let's dig in a little bit and figure out what the role of the EPA is and how they better work with the state agencies to minimize the cost of regulations and maximize the outcomes that are intended from those regulations. That's a discussion we should always have, whether it's a Republican administration or a Democrat administration.
Very good. You also signed on to a letter with 22 others wanting to get out of the Paris Climate Accord. And that kind of put us in a room by ourselves internationally. Personally, I think that the goals of the Paris Climate Accord are noble, but can you tell us a little bit more about your decision to do that?
Yeah. Actually, I could draw a parallel between that and Senate Bill 3. If you review the accord, then there's really no enforcement mechanism. Everybody gets together and says we're going to aspire to do this. There's a lot of information that I'm given access to that doesn't look like some of the biggest polluters, the emerging nations, China, which will probably be the largest economy over the next decade or 15 years, had any real serious commitment to achieving the same sort of standards of others. And quite honestly, even before President Trump announced the intent to withdraw under the rules of the accord, very few countries were even making the baseline headway that they committed to when they signed the accord, or the signatories. I think there may only be one nation that at least hasn't signed on to it. There are various levels of engagement on the accord. But for those who said, "Yep, we're in," we're gonna achieve the standards. There's not a lot of evidence that that they've made that much progress. They've talked a lot about it, but one of the reasons they haven't, and one of the reasons they may not, if they run into economic problems or other steps along the way, is there's no enforcement mechanism. People need to understand, if you really want to get serious about global warming, you want to get serious about climate change, then stop doing agreements that are able to be executed surely through the Article 2 branch, the executive branch, and start doing treaties that have legal constructs that force the signers of the treaties to live up to the terms of the treaty or be in violation of the treaty. Then you have a due process mechanism for holding people up. I think if you did that, it would be remarkable if you went back and say, let's take the Paris Climate Accords and say, now it's a treaty. It's going to have a force of law, and there are going to be enforcement mechanisms in place. It'd be interesting to see how many people who've already signed on would sign on if they knew that they had to comply to the absolute letter of those treaties. But it was the same thing. It was an example where the administration, I think they were well-intentioned, but instead of doing the hard work of getting a coalition in Congress who would endorse the treaty, they got it's a good starting point. Maybe it even provides a basis for a global treaty, but they didn't engage a very important branch of the U.S. government to make sure that it had enduring quality. And the people we'll be talking about 30 years from now, who are still going to be pumping trillions of tons of carbon into the air, are likely to be doing that unless you have that kind of enforcement mechanism in place.
Very good. We recently had a bill passed in North Carolina called House Bill 589, and that was well after your time as a state legislature. But as part of that bill, there was a poison pill stuck in it that basically put a moratorium on wind development in North Carolina until a study was conducted. And despite the fact that several leaders in the military had written letters and said, wind really doesn't create a threat to the military operations, that was used as a reason why we should have a study and we should stop all wind development in the state until that time. Now, Chowan County and other counties are benefiting to the tune of almost $1 million a year in additional local taxes from these deals. But it's been a heated debate among kind of the far extreme side. What are your thoughts about wind energy in the military, and just on a national level, but also for North Carolina?
Well, I think, General Matt, there are legitimate encroachment concerns around some of the larger structures, particularly if you're in areas where there are a lot of air training and readiness activities. But there's a way to work it out. I mean, if you're in Chowan County, you can figure out a way to deal with what may be some flight corridors. In other areas, you may not be able to. But I think General Mattis has been clear that he thinks that you can strike a balance. There are areas where where wind farms have popped up in and around key Air Force bases. There's one I can think of on the West Coast that created a need to change the training missions because of the disruption to radar and certain mission sets that they use this particular base for. But that's not the majority. That's not the rule. It's the exception. And there's a way to work around it. I'm not sure that I would have gone about, I may have made sure in whatever policy, if I were Speaker, that we deferred to the DOD when they could present a compelling case that a certain plan was disruptive to what they're trying to do or what they're planning on doing. If you keep in mind, some of these areas like in North Carolina and South Carolina, where we have large contiguous areas of training, training bases, Fort Bragg and some of the areas in South Carolina, there are legitimate reasons why you want to keep some of those corridors open. Actually, I've met with but to give you an idea, the DOD is sensitive to conservation. Back when I was Speaker, I had someone from the DOD come to my office and talk about this remarkable plan for acquiring property to put into conservation that would also ensure that the southeast part of the United States would have a very large area that they could do unencumbered training, air and ground training, and do it in a way that they have to adhere to high environmental standards even on the base. In General Madison, people in DoD get it. They're not anti wind turbine or wind energy. I think there's a way to have both. And hopefully that study will move through and we'll be able to enjoy the economic impact and see the success of wind where it makes sense, the same way we've seen the success of solar in the state.
We don't have much time left. I want to be respectful of the time we have with you. But I do want to say last summer, for those of you who know, two companies that have primarily foreign ownership basically presented a trade case to the United States International Trade Commission. And they complained that there was dumping from Chinese, but also pretty much everybody else around the world into the country. And they suggested very high tariffs that would be set on the import of solar cells and solar modules into our country. This created a panic, and last summer prices for solar modules went up 30%. And while solar is probably the cheapest form of energy generation at peak hours today or during sunlight hours, it still creates a kind of an unnatural cost increase for solar electricity. Now, this happened before the tariff was implemented. We reached out to your office, and I must say I have never experienced a better response on Capitol Hill. We're trying to do something to convince your colleagues. Your staff was involved. But can you tell us a little bit about what you did and what you're doing now to try to ensure that our consumers and our ratepayers and our customers don't suffer from more expensive energy costs than they need to pay because of this tariff?
Well, of course, we got letters and had others join a letter. I talked with the trade representative personally and was trying to explain to them that, look, if we have, for whatever reason, and maybe with tax reform, the numbers change and there can be businesses that can create cost competitive solar panels here in the United States. But until we do, why would we artificially inflate the cost of inputs to an industry that's doing real good things on renewables in this state? And we've tried to, the administration, there are certain trade policies where I'm not on the same page with the administration. I'm more of a free trade person, and I think that in this particular case, there was no clear case for or justification for the tariff. It was clear that the administration was going to take some action. So then again, we started working on what could we do to at least minimize the impact on the utility grade operations that are really the backbone of the success story we've seen in North Carolina. And we made some progress, but I really regret it that we even had to go through it.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I just wanted you to see who's here. Before we finish, Senator Tillis, I wanted to ask one question. We do have a number of students in the audience here. We have a number of members from utilities, from the industry, from the Utilities Commission. But if you look back to yourself when you were 22 and you had to give yourself some form of advice, what would you have done? What would you have said?
I think be analytical. Fortunately, I was blessed early in my career, even when I was going to school. I didn't get my four-year degree until I was almost 37 years old. So I spent a lot of time in public school. But early in my career, I was blessed with the opportunity to work in research and development and take crazy ideas and try to make them commercially viable. I spent a couple of years up in Boston at a company called Wayne Laboratories that was high tech and the early stages of artificial intelligence. What we need you all to do is to not take the bait. The problem and the challenge that you have as a generation is you have so much data coming at you that a lot of times people don't take the time to really synthesize it into meaningful information. And if you want to pursue public policy formulation, don't take the bait of getting your information from any one source. Sit down and come up with a rational way to analyze it and understand the trade-offs. In my office, I've got my staff working on a Six Sigma certification. Very odd for a Senate office to be encouraging continuing education at all, but certainly one that involves with Six Sigma and an analytical implementation process. So spend time early in really trying to understand options analysis and financial analysis, risk assessment and risk analysis, because having that discipline early, if you want to get into public policy, either as an elected official or as an advocate for one policy or another, you will never regret having invested time now while you're in school or just out of school, going back and getting meaningful execution experience with these sorts of disciplines.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Senator Tillis. And I'm sorry we didn't have time for questions from the audience, but we wish you luck at the...
thank you. I've got to get into a suit, and I'm about 5 minutes away from a state trooper showing up in my driveway so that we can get into the security perimeter. So I'm sorry if I'd been there out of state, as long as y'all wanted to ask questions. And if you have any, again, if something's come up here, if there was a question that you wanted to ask, if you go to my website at tillis.senate.gov, you can submit an email there. I'll have my policy folks look at it. But I'll also make sure that if you identify yourself as having participated in this session, I get literally millions of emails or letters over the last 3 years that I've been there, probably close to 2 million. But if you indicate in the email that you were a participant in this conference, I'll make sure that before you receive a response, that I have an opportunity to look at it, so that it's not only something that my policy staff had advised me on, but it's something unique to your question. I'd be happy to do that. Sorry, I don't have time to answer your specific questions this morning.